Hello, and welcome to the Conservative Christian Commentator. I'm your host, Mycroft, and today we're going to be talking about the 4B movement and how it's coming to America and what that means. Before we get into it, though, I would like to give a quick channel update. You may notice, if you looked at my channel page, that there has been about a 3-month gap between this video and the last video. The reason for that is I've been having a serious think and a serious talk with God about what exactly I want this channel to be and what I want to bring to the commentary community at large, I guess. Now, I know that I'm not particularly knowledgeable, and I know that I'm not particularly wise. I'm seeking to become more of both, but I am not extraordinary in any of these measures. However, the one measure that I seek to be extraordinary in is I seek to be extraordinary in my surrender to God. And I am learning more each day about what radical surrender to God actually means for my life. So, that's what I want to bring to this channel. I want to color every single video that I publish will be colored with the perspective of someone who is at least attempting to be radically surrendered to God. And this is a daily struggle, a daily walk. I'm going to shoot for about probably 5 videos a week, hopefully more. And hopefully not less, but we'll see how things go. So, let's get into the 4B movement, its origins, and the reasons why people are adopting it, and what the impact is. First off, the 4B movement originated in South Korea, with the feminist movement in South Korea decreeing that men are no longer worth anything, and so the 4B movement has decided it consists of women who are saying 4 no's to men. The 4 no's essentially boil down to no sex, no relationships or dating, it's interchangeable, and no children, and no cohabitation. So essentially, no relationships with men other than purely platonic friendships. It's essentially the feminist version of I'm gonna throw my toys down and walk out of the playground. It's not a tremendously mature movement in my perspective. I used to think something like that. If you would have asked me probably 8 or 10 years ago what about this movement, I would have probably said it was justified. But now knowing what I know, it really isn't. There's not really a good reason to throw down your toys and walk away from the playground, so to speak. You're not going to be helping anyone by doing that. You're not even going to be helping yourself, not in the long term. But we'll get into that later. I'm not going to comment on the 4B movement in South Korea as much as possible, because while I do know some facts that are directly contrary to the agenda that the 4B movement is pushing in South Korea, I do not know all the facts. So I will not be filling in the movement in South Korea as much as I can. So we're gonna mostly cover its impact on America, because I do happen to live in America. At time of recording, it is exactly 1 week after the election. And when I post this, it'll be 1 week after the election has been called for President Donald Trump. I personally am rather happy about it, but there are many people on the internet who, shall we say, are less than happy about it. I've been rather entertained by the, frankly, quite childish montages of women sitting in their car screaming and crying, and generally acting like toddlers. It is kind of entertaining in a sad way, but the 4B movement originated from South Korea and is being adopted by these people. And I'm not going to try to be cynical about it, even though I am a generally cynical person, but I want to talk about the reasons why women in America seem to believe that this is a good idea. And I do want to clarify, this is not all women in America, because thankfully, as the feminists do keep saying, women are not a monolith, and neither are men. Even though the feminists seem to think that men are a monolith, but we're not going to get to that. We might actually. But the reason why some women in the U.S. are adopting this is because they believe that Trump has been convicted of multiple felonies, which he has been convicted, but really it was a stacked court against him, and the case that he wasn't allowed to defend himself, and yeah, if you dig deeper than the surface into those cases, it is a whole bunch of buhaki, shall we say, and I'm not even a lawyer. Um, I would be interested in seeing and getting an actual lawyer who is not heavily biased towards the left, like certain YouTube lawyers are, actually going into the details about why that case was so bad. But with that aside, they also believe that a vote for Donald Trump is a vote against what they call women's rights. Now, as a conservative and as a Christian primarily, I believe that rights are not something that you can vote against or vote for, because rights are not given to you or taken away by the government. The government can try to take away your rights. The government can suppress your rights, but they have historically not been able to work out very long. Look at the downfall of Russia, the downfall of the Roman Empire, the downfall of North Korea, the current and ongoing downfall of China. North Korea and China are both in very serious decline, and they're not running sustainable methods, partially because they are directly suppressing human rights. And the reason why those rights cannot be suppressed by a government for more than a few, maybe decades, or maybe even a few centuries if they are especially good at it, the reason why is because God gives those rights to humans. And those rights center around the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as outlined by the Declaration of Independence, and enshrined in our Constitution. Primarily, the rights that I believe that God gives us are, the right to life, which is enshrined in multiple different ways in the Constitution, but also the right to freedom of speech, the right to defend yourself, which is enshrined in our Constitution as the Second Amendment, or the right to bear arms, and the right to freedom of association, and some believe the right to freedom of expression, although that's kind of nebulous in my opinion, but freedom of association and freedom to speak and freedom to defend yourself are things that God has bestowed upon us as humans. There are other rights that you could argue. I would argue that the other rights that are in the Bill of Rights are rather ancillary to these, what I would call foundational rights. Now, the right that is usually in question, and I'm using right as a purely descriptive term because that is how they describe it. I do not believe that this is a right, nor should it be a right, but this is how they describe it. So from their perspective, they believe that their right to abortion is being destroyed. And they also believe that the right to gay marriage will also be destroyed. Now, as a Christian, I want to fully disclose that I believe that both abortion and gay marriage should largely be banned in the United States. Not because the people who are engaging in those practices are bad, but because they are generally bad for America, and because they are generally bad for the people who end up engaging in them in the long run. They do not contribute to a productive society, and they do not contribute to a society that glorifies God. We can go into why later, but that is the essential summary. But I do also recognize that this is not a tenable policy position for most politicians, and that this is not something that will get you elected, and this is not something that America is really ready to hear yet. So, given that, I believe that Trump has taken a rather diplomatic stance, and he's taken the stance of, we're going to kick the decision back to the states. We're not going to say that the federal government is ensuring this. We're going to say that the states can assure or not assure this as they believe fit. And I would agree with that stance in general. The right to abortion, as it's called, was originated from the Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade that probably everyone has heard about. That is rather famous or infamous, depending on which circles you frequent. But Roe versus Wade expanded the right to privacy that has been somewhat interpreted in the Constitution out of, I want to say, the right to freedom of association, but I'm not sure if that's right. But the Supreme Court had already taken the right to privacy as an extension of one of the other rights in the Constitution, and then as an extension of the right to privacy, they took the right to abortion. So legally, it was already on very tenuous grounds, and on those tenuous legal grounds, it was overturned fairly recently. And all of the conservative communities rejoiced. And all of the liberal communities started crying. but humor aside, the very tenuous legal grounds on which it was established were overturned recently. So what effectively ended up happening is that abortion became a decision that each state government would make. And immediately following the case, multiple different states enacted full abortion bans. However, I would like to note that every single one of these bans, if you actually read the text of the law, every single one of these bans has an exception for rape or incest. And also, one side note, a lot of abortion activists are declaring ectopic pregnancies as abortions, which is not true. Ectopic pregnancies are when the pregnancy goes wrong, the pregnancy is not viable, and essentially both mother and baby will die if an ectopic pregnancy is left untreated. So if you're gonna, it's a choice between either having two people die or one person die, and so the choice is quite easy. We have to let the baby die, and we have to save the mother. In choices where it's either the mother or the baby, which are less than 0.1% of all cases of pregnancies, far less. But in the case of that, that's a much more complicated decision that I don't think I'm going to get into, and we can get into this later. But this video is not about abortion. This video is about the 4B movement. I'm just trying to touch on abortion at a high level here. So, back to the high level. Most people who are for the right to abortion, as they call it, believe that these bans are infringing upon their human rights, as they would say. And immediately when you start to discuss things with an abortion activist, they will start to use the examples of rape and incest as a way to guilt trip you into agreeing with them and saying that, well, would you have sympathy for a young girl who was like 12 who was raped? And the answer is yes, absolutely. That's horrible. As a Christian, however, I do not believe that the child should pay for the sins of their father, and in some cases mother, because women can rape men too, and actually do in very similar numbers to how men rape women, but you're never going to hear that from anything like mainstream media. But aside from that, children should not pay for the sins of their parents. And that is something that Jesus introduced. That was originally enshrined in the Abrahamic law and was rather reversed by Jesus. And very frequently, you will pay for the sins of your mother and father in the form of legacy, like what legacy they leave. But that's not directly what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is that the child should not be killed because the child was, shall we say, conceived in sin, to put it gently. Just because the child was conceived in sin does not mean that the child should be killed. If that were the case, then every child should be killed, because every child was conceived in sin because we are sinful creatures. But they do not believe it to be that way, because they do not believe that the baby is a actual baby while inside the womb. So, the reason why they use these arguments of rape or incest is to essentially morally blackmail the people who oppose them into agreeing with them. And you can expose this double standard if you ask them, would you support a full abortion ban if it had full exceptions for rape and incest, as most of the abortion bans do? I'm pretty sure all, but I'm not 100% sure on all, so I'm not going to say all. But most of these abortion bans, the overwhelming majority, have exceptions for rape or incest. And it is a good thing to have those exceptions, because we need to compromise with people in order to allow people to understand where we come from. Now, they will hardly ever agree to such an abortion ban, because that would get rid of about 99% of abortions, because 99% of abortions are elective abortions. 99% of abortions do not need to happen by that definition that they are trying to get you to agree to. So they don't agree to the very, very statements that they're trying to guilt you into agreeing with. So that exposes the double standard of just using the cases of rape and incest for moral grandstanding, which I believe is very wrong and should not be done. So, because they believe that abortion should be a form of essentially birth control, abortion and birth control are not equivalent and should not be treated as such. Abortion is murder, birth control is not. Birth control is preventative. Abortion and birth control has its own harms. We're not going to get into that. But abortion is directly murder. And I'm not going to get into too much because otherwise this video is going to get restricted. And it's probably already going to get restricted because of the topics I'm talking about. But we're going to go from there. So, the reason why they believe that abortion should be given as an elective right to any and all women is that they do not believe that the baby is a baby, basically. And you can see that they're starting to push towards more extreme things like post-birth abortions, which is really just infanticide with fancy names. But they also do not believe that the baby is actually a baby until some nebulous point that no doctor can actually quantify, and that nobody who's not even a doctor can actually quantify unless you actually use unless you actually believe that life is established at conception, which separate DNA is established at conception. So yes, life is established at conception. There's no other standard that does not also exclude someone who is old or infirm or ill or unconscious or dying. So if you want to argue for abortion using the unconsciousness argument, or using the argument or arguing that our human nature comes from our consciousness or our ability to make decisions or our ability to survive on our own, that really is very, very fragile. But these are the arguments that they use. So, because they believe abortion is a woman's right, and because they believe that right is going to be taken away, neither of which are true, it is not a right, and it is also not being taken away because thanks to the freedom of association, you can live wherever you want. And so if you'd like to live in a state that happens to allow abortion up until birth, then you can do that. You can just move to California. And if you want to live in a state that does not allow abortion except in cases of rape or incest, then you can move to something like Texas. But because they don't want to move and they want abortion to be a nationally guaranteed right, they believe that Trump is going to institute a national abortion ban, despite him actually saying that he's not going to initiate a national abortion ban, and taking considerable flack for that from a lot of the people on the conservative side. They believe he's still going to do it, and the reason for that is because the media has been saying he's going to be doing it. He's going to do it for something like 4 to 6 years now. So, because of that belief, they also believe that he's going to overturn the right to gay marriage, which is another Supreme Court decision that I can't remember the name of. It was actually decided fairly recently, and it is also on very legally shaky ground. Now, my personal belief is that the state should not be involved in marriage at all. The state, and I'm using the state to refer to all government, the state should not be involved in your marriage at all, because marriage is a covenant between a man, woman, and God. Marriage is not a contract, and bringing the state into it means it is a contract. The state turns it into a contract. Outside of the church, it is a contract, but the state should not have any say over marriages, and only God has any business in dictating who marries who. And God has already rather clearly dictated that marriage is between a man and a woman. So gay marriage, as it were called, does not fit the biblical definition of marriage, and so as a Christian I must oppose it. This does not mean that the people who engage in gay marriage, or even the people who engage in abortion, are necessarily inherently evil. God will save all of us no matter what our actions are. But just speaking from a purely societal perspective, gay marriage is not a productive method of reproduction, and it is not something that leads to a productive society, shall we say. I'm not going to go into all the historical significance behind that, but gay marriage is not something that is conducive to a productive society. And so just purely on a societal level, we should not be enshrining gay marriage as a right. We should just be we should essentially just be kicking the state out of marriage entirely. But, so the state shouldn't be able to dictate who can marry who, or in any way, shape, or form, because they've been fantastically bad at that for the entirety of human history. So, marriage is designed to be a sacrament. It is not designed to be something that you can just play with and engage in your fantasies. So marriage is inherently, by the biblical definition, between a man and a woman only. But I'm not going to be able to dictate what other people do. This is just how I apply it to my life. So, let's get back out of the weeds. Because they believe that those two rights will be overturned, and also Trump has mentioned that, just one more thing, though, Trump has mentioned that with gay marriage, he wants to kick it back to the states as well, which is also another constitutionally sensible notion. This does follow with the Constitution, and it's rather consistent with his previous track record, and I believe that's probably what he's going to attempt to do. I don't know if it'll work, but we'll see. So, because of those perceived rights that they believe are going to be taken away, and because they also believe that Trump is going to take away every single right of women, because the media has been saying that for who knows how long, and they have been saying that and saying that and saying that, and eventually, if they keep saying it for long enough, you're going to start to believe it if you don't hear anything to refute it. But because they believe that, they are taking on the 4B movement, which is the 4 no's, and they are essentially doing, entertainingly, the feminist version of what we call the MGTOW movement, which is men going their own way. So this is WGTOW, women going their own way, but they don't want to call it that because they don't want to be associated with that movement, because that movement is hateful and racist, and when they do it, it's hateful and racist, but when we do it, it's justifiable, and it is righteous. And it is highly entertaining how their standards are, because when the standards are just so good that you have to double them, you know that something is not right. But they believe that women should not be associating with men, and I find it kind of interesting how a lot of the young ladies who like to spout women are not a monolith, women are not a monolith, women are not a monolith, suddenly decide that they have the right to speak for all women when they say, men, you are not going to be wanted by women if you voted for Trump. Why would you think that you can suddenly now speak for all women when you spent your entire life saying that women are not a monolith and nobody can speak for all women? But now suddenly you're the dictator of all women. This does not make sense, but I think that the 4B movement is rather well summed up by a colloquial saying. It goes something like this: the trash takes itself out. And it's rather apropos here, which I find rather entertaining, but it essentially means that those women who were the ones who were being the most promiscuous and creating a lot of the problems that we have in our society by being promiscuous, because promiscuity destroys people. And I'm not saying that the guys who were also involved in that promiscuity were any better. It takes 2 to tango, and it really doesn't help either party. But if one party stops, it still takes 2 to tango. So you can't really tango if one party stops. So I think actually the 4B movement, in that sense, is good, because it's going to cut down on sex outside of marriage. It's going to cut down on, well, hopefully, it's going to cut down on promiscuity in clubs, on streets, in advertisements. For that reason, I'm kind of half rooting for the 4B movement, because I don't think sex should be happening outside of marriage at all, because sex is a sacrament, and it is designed to consecrate a marriage, and if you do sex outside of marriage, there's nothing to consecrate, so you're only consecrating love for yourself, which is just pride, and it just ends up being a whole spiritual spiral. But be that as it may, the 4B movement actually sometimes kind of funnily coincides with the Christian movement, where they have the same goals of reducing sex outside of marriage, but for such wildly different reasons that it is really, really quite funny. But because the 4B movement has started to become popular in the United States, here's what I believe will end up happening, is that a minority of liberal women will take up the 4B movement, and as they continue in the 4B movement, they will become increasingly more bitter and increasingly more hateful towards men, because they blame all of their problems on men, and they don't take any of the responsibility for their issues on themselves, because men caused all of their problems, and men are what is wrong with the world, and if women ruled the world, it would be such a utopia, which is such bull hockey that it is quite entertaining to watch. But the 4B movement essentially embodies a couple of the toxic femininity traits, one of which is the it's kind of like the ever-present daughter, which is the one who never grows up and never takes any responsibility for her actions. And that is one of the ways in which femininity can go toxic, because both toxic masculinity and toxic femininity exist. Both are completely misrepresented by modern media, but for everything that has a positive, it also has a negative. Femininity is positive and amazing, masculinity is positive and amazing, and both of them can be twisted. And the 4B movement is an excellent example of how femininity can be twisted to be toxic. And it is also going to increase the objectification of men, which is not something that is ever talked about. But a lot of the women who parrot the line of men objectify women and men are only looking at women for sex do not realize how that line objectifies men. It objectifies both men and women to believe that A, women are only good for sex, and that B, men are only out for sex. The world is not about sex. It does not revolve around that. Men and women are very much more than their ability to procreate. Marriages do not just exist for procreation. Marriages also exist to be a helpmate, to be a this word has been kind of misused, but I guess you could after a fashion say a partnership, where two people work together to build the best life that they can for them and their children. So it is not just about sex, and I find it entertaining that the very people who are complaining the most about how supposedly men see women only for sex only see men as interested in sex. And that is the effect of that is going to essentially be that some of the most promiscuous women are going to kind of stop being promiscuous, hopefully, and they might just end up kind of taking themselves out of the gene pool, which at this point I think might be a good idea. If they believe that if their beliefs are so extreme that they believe that they need to take them out of the gene pool, well, goodbye, and you'll have yourself a nice life, and we'll be over here creating legacies. Because, as they so eloquently put it, women are not a monolith. And there are many women who will agree and who will marry men who happen to be conservative, because a majority of women also voted for President Trump. And it depends on the demographic, whether it's a majority or a minority. And just like with men, it also depends on the demographic, whether it's a majority or a minority. It works out very, very much differently depending on your demographic. But an overall majority of women and an overall majority of men voted for President Trump. And so those overall majority of women and those overall majority of men are going to go build a legacy while they decide to go cry in a corner. And I know this may seem a little unsympathetic, but I don't think that the 4B movement is really going to surprise anyone, nor is it really going to make much of an impact. And I have very little sympathy for the proponents of the 4B movement. I do have some sympathy for them because they're greatly deceived, but I have very little sympathy for them because at some point you really have to make an effort to rid yourself of all deception that you can, and once you do rid yourself of all deception that you can, you'll realize how stupid you're being, and they're making no attempt to rid themselves of any deception. They're just trying to dive deeper into the deception, and because it feeds their ego and because it feeds a lot of things that are unhealthy. So I don't believe that the 4B movement will have any impact on society bigger than a whimper, but it is interesting to talk about because the people who are going to be part of the 4B movement in America are going to be the most vocal, the most frequently online, and the most prolific commentators on the topic. So we need to, as both the sensible center and the right, need to address this issue and actually call it out for what it really is, which is just femininity gone toxic. It's like if you leave an apple out on the counter for 3 weeks and then you come back and you're surprised that it is rotten. This happens when you leave something out for too long, and when you don't actually take care of it, when you don't nourish it or utilize it for what it's meant to be utilized for, then it's just going to rot. And in this case, their femininity, they have chosen to allow their femininity to rot, which is in some cases very sad. But in most cases, this is kind of a case of, well, you brought it on yourself, and ultimately the rest of us can't save you from the consequences of your own actions. So I hope this video has been rather informative, and I think that the 4B movement will be interesting to follow, and I for one will be following it with somewhat mild interest to kind of see where things go. And we're going to talk about some different stuff in the next video. The next video will be something about peer pressure, and actually how sometimes that can be positive, because I've been thinking about that recently, and I wanted to share that with you guys. So I hope you'll join me for the next video, and whether you do or whether you don't, I hope you have an excellent week, and I want to thank you very much for watching.